This week, we'll be exploring unsolved mysteries that range from one of the most unknown and mysterious languages and civilizations of the ancient world to the almost novel-like murder mystery of a man in Dublin found murdered in his office behind a locked door that was locked from the inside, to the horrific case of the 8 people murdered on a boat, violently and for seemingly no reason, in Alaska in 1982. We will explore all of these and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is Darjeeling tea with milk, and join me as we explore the unsolved mysteries Iceberg. Guccifer 2.0. So this is a bit of a strange political entry, I guess. It was the name of this person or group that claimed to be behind the hacking of the DNC. They hacked and leaked a bunch of their sensitive documents in the 2016 presidential election with Trump and Hillary. Guccifer 2.0 is actually different to the original Guccifer, who was a Romanian hacker who hacked various politicians and figureheads sort of thing, and he created his name by combining Gucci with Lucifer, as he said he had the style of Gucci but the light of Lucifer, which is a bit of a strange claim, but don't get 2.0 and the original confused, even though they should have, just used different names. But some people think Guccifer 2.0 is basically a persona created by Russian intelligence, but Russia denies all connection with this hacker, and the hacker themselves says that they are not Russian, but that they are Romanian like the original Guccifer. So we officially still have no idea to this day who Guccifer 2.0 actually is, other than that they're a hacker who seems to enjoy targeting political targets, but that's really about all. Gummy with a Twist is a video, a YouTube video, a scary one, which features the Gummy Bear song in Hungarian that plays for a little bit, and then out of nowhere comes the K-Fee coffee commercial. It was uploaded in 2007, had almost as many dislikes as it had likes, and due to it mainly just scaring kids who happen to like the Gummy Bear song, it was eventually taken down by the creator, and for a period of time it was considered lost media. It has since been found and re-uploaded, so kind of mystery solved, but it is always nice to see people using that jump scare. The Harappan language is a crazy interesting one. This was the language of the Indus Valley civilization, or the Harappan civilization as it is sometimes known, and they were this huge civilization that spanned for like 2,000 years, from roughly 3300 BC to 1300 BC, around the Indus River and modern day Pakistan, India sort of area. The Harappan civilization was thought to be bigger and more widespread than any other civilization at the time. This includes the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Chinese even, and consisted of an estimated 5 million citizens. It was first discovered or rediscovered in the 1800s by a man named Charles Masson. Now he is an interesting figure in and of himself, but he originally came to this area in India through the East India Company army at the age of 21. He was there working for 5 years or so before running away and becoming what was known as a deserter. He then traveled around India, various other areas such as Afghanistan, and basically became a Indiana Jones type of character. He would explore ruins, uncover areas, uncover rare coins and artifacts, and was one of the first Europeans, at least, to properly discover some of these areas, languages, and civilizations. He excavated over 50 Buddhist sites over the years, and collected as many as 47,000 coins during this time. Then, more than 20 years later, in 1842, he returned to London, settled down, married, had kids, and then died shortly after. Masson chose originally for his explorations of the East a route and sites that closely tied in with the military campaign of Alexander the Great. And from these explorations, he became one of, if not the first European to rediscover the city of Alexandria in the Caucasus, which was an ancient buried city near Bagram that was founded by Alexander the Great during his conquests. And here he found seals, he found coins, he found rings, just all sorts of ancient goodies. And he was also, as we mentioned earlier, the first European to discover the Harappa ruins. He found and made note of the many artifacts that apparently just lay around here kind of half buried. And this was before the Western world was really getting serious about stuff like archaeology, you know, making an active effort to go out there, explore, translate languages. So this was like just before the boom sort of thing. And also a lot of the local people didn't really care about these sites at all. They just saw them as whatever, these old ruins over the way. They weren't bothered about preserving the sites. In fact, a lot of them were, if not completely, then at least partially dismantled. The local people had simply been, you know, taking the bricks, taking the structures apart in order to build stuff of their own nearby. So they weren't interested about securing or preserving any artifacts, any old ruins or sites, in trying to figure out about these ancient people, in trying to translate one of their ancient languages. I guess they were more like, you know, practical in a way, and the Europeans were more curious, more awe-inspired. So partly because of these two reasons, there was a lot to discover, and not many people out there either willing or able to do it. And one of the things Masson discovered, as we mentioned earlier, was the Harappan language, which we'll get into in just a little bit. But first we need to mention a little bit about the Harappan civilization, which was honestly really quite something. These cities were these huge, well-designed cities with constant trade happening from nearby and faraway nations. And I mean, honestly, just look at these photos. Just imagine for a second being a lone explorer in the 1800s and stumbling upon or seeing these ancient ruins, uncovering coins, artifacts, little inscriptions that you have no idea what they mean, and perhaps clues about who these people worshipped, what their beliefs were, how their societies worked, what technologies they had, what they got up to on a, you know, day-to-day basis. Super cool. There were notably no really giant structures in the cities. You know, no pyramids or ziggurats as you had in Egypt or Mesopotamia. The buildings and homes were all built out and planned on a really well-structured and well-ordered grid pattern, and they all had fantastic drainage and sewage systems, which were honestly the absolute best for their time and were far more advanced than any other civilization at that point in time. The cities had relatively large walls, which likely protected them from invasions and floods, and there were a few larger buildings in the cities, but these were thought most likely to be communal sort of places. So public baths, communal areas, political meeting places, you know, where people in the town could meet up, exchange ideas and technologies, perhaps design the city plans, just really cool stuff. And I fell into a rabbit hole about these people, and I could honestly probably go on a tangent about them all day. They were seemingly super advanced for their time, super fair and egalitarian, had some incredible technologies and architecture, and as we said, a seemingly full language that we to this day still haven't been able to translate. Perhaps something like the Egyptian Rosetta Stone will turn up, you know, to maybe help us translate from this language into another one that we know a little better perhaps. And it would be really cool to understand this language, as it would give us a greater insight into these people, into their technologies and beliefs and way of life. But until then, we'll just have to settle for these incredible sights and these gorgeous discoveries. Henryk Siwiak. So he was this strange case in that he was the only murdered person in New York on September 11th. And he was actually the last person to die on that date. And he wasn't killed anywhere near the towers. He was actually killed a few neighborhoods over, just before midnight, after heading out to meet someone for a potential job opportunity. So it's late at night and Henryk is preparing to head out for this interview he has with a guy that he doesn't know too much about. So I mean, it's a great start already. He is wearing his favorite camo jacket, his camo pants, his black boots, and carrying a backpack with a change of clothes in them. And before he leaves, he asks his landlady for, you know, kind of directions, advice on how to get there. And she tells him, she asks him, she even begs him not to go out. She said the area that he had planned to go to was kind of a dodgy area, and it was late at night, people were likely on edge from the attacks that happened earlier in the day. But he insisted he would be fine, and so he left to go meet this guy for the interview. He left the house, got off at the subway stop that he was supposed to get off at, and then took a wrong turn, ended up in the wrong neighborhood. And as some of the witnesses said, they heard outside shouting, an argument, and then they heard several gunshots. When the police and ambulance were eventually called, they found Henryk on the street, having been shot once in the lung, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation for this one was a little weak, as you can imagine, the police for the entirety of New York were a little stretched thin on that day. They were dealing with tons of anxious citizens, with the cleanup efforts, with a few instances of looting going on. Like, it was just a high security sort of situation, and a lot of them were standing guard for other potential attacks that might occur on that day. So Henryk's body was taken away, evidence like the shell casings were collected, canvassing was done with door-to-door questioning, but the few witnesses that there were didn't really see much, and they weren't really able to come up with any leads or suspects, and all of this was done, Henry's investigation, with a reduced team size. So the people collecting the evidence, there was less of them than there should have been. The people going door to door, there was less of them. So it seems like Henryk's murder didn't really get as much attention as it should have done. But as I said, the entire city was super packed up at that point, so it's hard to say what is reasonable in this case. His sister thinks that Henryk might have been killed because it was 9/11, people were on edge, and although he was from Poland, Henryk had somewhat of a darker complexion, and he spoke with an accent. He had kind of broken English. He was wearing, combat fatigues with a backpack, black boots, so maybe someone got startled and confused, thought that he was, planning something, and then when communications broke down, shots started to be fired. The killing got very little media attention. No new witnesses have since come forward. No new evidence has been gathered. And some 23 years later, Henryk's murder is still a cold case and still unsolved. The Hessdalen Lights. So these are these lights from an unknown source, or sources, that have been appearing in the Hessdalen Valley since the 1930s. They are usually white, yellow, or red, which, that's basically the most regular colors you can think of. But theories for this one range from extraterrestrial activities to regular terrestrial activities, like, cars and headlights and airplanes sort of thing, to illusions, to mirages, to stars, or to spontaneous, combusting, airborne, mining dust particles, which is honestly my favorite theory. They are another interesting example of essentially ghost lights that hopefully we'll solve worldwide sometime soon. The Hodge Conjecture. So this is an unsolved math problem, essentially. It is a very complex problem that has $1 million reward for anyone able to either prove or disprove it. And it has obviously not yet been solved. It genuinely hurt my brain trying to learn about this. Just look at all of this. It is bonkers. Let me know in the comment section if you actually understand any of this. But it's basically, if the theory is true, it would allow us to determine far more information about a mathematical shape or dimension or reality than we are currently able to do. Bloody complex one, this, but take a crack at it and maybe you can win the $1 million. The investor boat murders was honestly a horrific case. It took place in Alaska 1982 on a fishing boat, and Mark Colthurst, his pregnant wife Irene Colthurst, their 2 children aged 4 and 5, and 4 fishing helpers essentially, all in their late teens, were out on the Investor, which was the name of their fishing boat, when they were all brutally murdered. It's kind of hard to describe this, so just try and imagine the scene. They're out on the waters fishing throughout the day. They eventually get back to the dock, and they don't tie up directly to the dock, as either it's a hassle or the dock is full, so they kind of daisy chain their boat to another boat, which is in turn daisy chained to another one. So you've got the dock, you've got one boat tied to it, another boat tied next to that, and then you have the Investor tied at the end. So this is where they stayed for the night. But that is all to say that if anyone wanted to get onto the Investor from, the dock, from land, they would need to first cross over these other 2 boats and potentially, risk running into these other crews before they got to the Investor. So that's what happened. They all tied up, they went to bed for the night, all of these 8 people, and then in the middle of the night, someone snuck onto the boat, past these other 2 boats, past these crews, and it is thought shot and killed all 8 people. And the other boats at the time were celebrating, they were having a party, and so with everyone drinking, with everyone, passed out, loud music playing earlier, it is reasonable to think that nobody might have heard or seen him. It is just rather strange though. The next morning, the crew members from these other boats, woke up, they were hungover, and they saw the Investor kind of drifting away, disconnected, and they worried for a little bit until they saw, a guy come up, say, "Hey, how you doing? Everything's fine," sort of thing. They assumed, it was one of the workers, and so they didn't really worry. The boat then was driven away, but little did they know at this point in time, they were looking at the guy who had just killed all 8 people aboard. The guy took the ship, drove it away to somewhere else, tried to actually sink it, got off board, but he then returned to the boat hours later, and the boat was still floating just fine. So he ended up filling it up with gasoline and setting the entire thing alight. Someone from another boat quickly saw the smoke, came over, and they actually saw the murderer, near the boat, and he was apparently super chill. He said, we're just burning the boat, or it was an accident or something. There's no one on board, everyone is off safe. And he kind of hung around for some reason and chatted and mingled with the guy. And the authorities actually instructed no one to try and put the boat out, as they deemed it to be too dangerous. So they just left it there, they let it burn, they let it do their thing. And eventually, when they investigated the boat, they found the remains of all 8 people. Mark and Irene were shot dead. The others were likely thought to have been shot dead, but they couldn't really tell because the fires had too badly damaged their bodies. The suspect, who was described as a white male of medium build in his early 20s, was thought to have left the scene, drove out of town, and was never seen again. And even though multiple people had spotted this guy, they didn't really have any immediate suspects. Basically, all of the evidence was burnt up during the fire, and, trying to search America for a white guy of medium build in his 20s, that narrows it down a lot. So the investigation kind of went on and on slowly, and 2 years later, the police arrested a man named John Peel. He had worked for Mark in the past, and even dated his sister, and he had somewhat a similar appearance to the suspect. He said, as most reasonable people would, that he was asleep at the time of the murders, but police obviously didn't believe him, as they brought him in, they arrested him, and they charged him for these 8 murders. He had 2 trials in the end, with the second one finding him not guilty. And on top of being found not guilty, he actually sued the state for wrongful prosecution. And he won, being awarded $900,000. And that was, believe it or not, basically the end of the case. Police firmly believed that John Peel committed these murders, but he was found not guilty by a jury of his peers, and so he couldn't be charged again for these murders. And because they believe so firmly that it was John, they have basically closed the case and are not really pursuing any extra evidence or the investigation. They believe they caught their guy, but the justice system basically failed them, which is a little ironic. But then there's the question of why exactly John would do something like this, when he seemed to know Mark and his family quite well. He didn't really have any bad blood with them, and he didn't have any criminal history or violent past, so it seems a little strange, and probably more likely in my opinion that it was just someone else. But that's where the case currently sits. James Spollin. So this one is like straight out of a murder mystery novel or something. It's 1856 and a man is found dead, murdered in his office, which was locked from the inside. Yeah, I'm surprised he wasn't killed with a candlestick as well. But this really was quite a brutal case. This was in Dublin, and at the time, there hadn't been one conviction of murder for the past 15 years, which made this case at the time especially horrific and startling. George Little's throat had been cut and his head bashed in, and he was found lying face down on his office floor in the Dublin Broadstone train station. In the office at the time was tons and tons of cash, which were the takings from the train station for the week, and not all of it was taken, only some of it, which is already a tiny bit strange. If you're gonna go through and murder someone, at least take a bag and take as much cash as you can. But after doing the accounts, it seems like only £330 was taken, which was obviously worth a lot more at that time. But my point is, they could have taken more. It was a very busy week at the station, lots and lots of cash was collected, and the entire investigation was honestly, even from the start, kind of a complete failure. The start of the investigation was delayed by like a day and a half. The crime scene wasn't secured properly. people were in and out of the office contaminating evidence. Some of the important evidence wasn't collected, and it was all really just a mess. Eventually, they drained the nearby canal and found a cutthroat razor and a hammer, which were very likely the murder weapons. They interviewed several people who worked at the station, several people who might have been nearby, but it seems like there weren't too many, as George was actually working late that night, and so a lot of his regular colleagues would have, gone home already. But it was even more and more like a murder mystery novel, because there were like little bits of evidence which pointed to like almost everyone they interviewed. Everyone was acting a little bit sus. A bunch of people lied about where they were at what times, and so it was very confusing because it was like everyone they interviewed seemed to be up to something. It was likely they all didn't murder the guy, but it was made an even more confusing case because of this. A few suspects were brought in, but were all eventually acquitted. Police didn't really have any more suspects or things to go on. That is, until a woman turned in her husband and said that he was responsible for the murder and she had helped him hide the cash that he stole. And this man was none other than James Spollin, who was just a random guy. He was working in the train station, and I guess either he did commit the murder or his wife just really didn't like him or something. So the police arrested him, they charged him with murder, but he too was eventually acquitted. And so at this point, they basically had no one. Maybe if they had sealed off the crime scene and actually had some evidence, but what do I know? And this is when a man with a very interesting theory came along called Frederick Bridges. He was a big pusher and believer in something called phrenology, which is a now debunked science that basically said you could tell a lot about someone's personality by the shape of their brain. So like if this part of the brain was responsible for like aggression, then you'd expect this part of the brain or skull to be more pronounced in a potentially aggressive person. And that was basically the theory. So after Spollin was acquitted, Bridges met up with him and offered him a bunch of cash to measure his skull and to get a plaster cast from it. To which Spollin said, "Heck yes, plaster me up and give me cash." So Bridges had this particular idea that was completely scientific and based on evidence, he said, that a regular, sane, normal human being had no more than 25 degrees between their eyebrow and their ear. So like that would be completely reasonable. But a psychopath apparently had, 35 degrees or even 45 degrees between the eyebrow and the ear. Crazy, right? Like, no, it literally sounds like crazy talk. But Bridges measured Spollin and then contacted authorities in Dublin and said, "Look, I know you already arrested him, tried him, and acquitted him for these crimes, but I measured his head in plaster and he is definitely a violent psychopath. So can you please arrest him?" Like, I'm not even making this up. This is exactly what happened. Bridges never received a reply, which I think is just as well. But this dude had some wild beliefs and faith in phrenology, where he genuinely believed not only could this help law enforcement, so, if you've got a bunch of suspects, do, the skull test sort of thing, find out which one is the violent criminal, and he's obviously the guilty one. But he believed that regular citizens should have their skull shape and size measured on a regular basis, and if they were found to have a, psychopath shaped head, apparently, that they should be immediately locked up to prevent them committing the violent crimes that they are obviously going to commit because of the shape of their head, which is some seriously unhinged stuff. So yeah, it's no wonder he didn't get a response back. Spollin took the money that he was paid, got on a boat to America, and started a new life over there, but Dublin never did find out who murdered George Little. Jeffrey Gebhardt was an awfully strange case where in 2012 Georgia, Jeffrey went out hunting with a hunting buddy of his, and the two ended up getting separated. They eventually found their way back to each other by evening time, but the next day the two went out hunting again in the same area and once again lost each other. So at 10 p.m. that night, after being separated for many hours, Jeffrey's friend wasn't able to get in touch with Jeffrey, and so he called 911 to report Jeffrey missing. But he found out from them that Jeffrey had actually been in contact with the local police. As he had called them, he said he was lost and needed help, but his calls kept dropping out due to a lack of signal. And so after he was reported missing, the police went out to search for Henry in the last place that his phone had pinged at, and they eventually found him, dead, on the floor with 17 stab wounds, 3 of which were directly to the heart. There lay beside him 2 knives, or rather 1 beside him, 1 underneath him, but no witnesses, no suspects, and strangely enough, only 1 set of footprints in the mud, which were Jeffrey's. So was he brutally, carefully murdered here? You know, out in the wilderness where there were no witnesses, no one to see it? Or was he attacked perhaps by an animal, which seems unlikely to me, just because of the nature of the attacks and the fact that there were, you know, knives around. It seems very likely that the knives were the weapon here. And since you don't see deer too often picking up knives and using them, it was very likely a human suspect. Now, whether this suspect was someone else committing a murder, or whether it was Jeffrey himself committing you know what, that is basically the main question in this case. And I know what you're thinking, because I thought exactly the same thing. You know, lost in the woods at night, 17 stab wounds, 3 of which were to the heart. There's no way that Jeffrey could have done this to himself. And the jury is honestly kind of out on that one. It is thought at least possible that Jeffrey could have done something like this to himself, you know, as long as he acted quickly before passing out or bleeding out. And there were only Jeffrey's knives found at the scene, only Jeffrey's blood, only Jeffrey's footprints, so you know, it doesn't really look good. And I think the mystery in this one comes from the contrasting evidence and scene, where you have the weapons, the footprints, the scenario, all kind of pointing to it being Jeffrey, but the wounds and the sheer nature of the attack point to it being an attack by someone else. So a very, very tragic and brutal case, no matter which way you look at it. Also a very confusing case, and one that has not been solved in the past 12 years. Kryptos is a cryptic sculpture that is on display at the George Bush Center for Intelligence in Virginia. It is a pretty cool sculpture made from copper, petrified wood, stone, plants, and a few other things. But the most important part are these copper sheets. And these sheets contain encrypted messages, 3 of which have been solved, with the 4th one remaining for the past 34 years unsolved. They all use different encryption techniques and methods, and the creator of both the puzzles and the sculptures has over the years given out, you know, little clues, translated a word or 2 for us every few years or so to try and, you know, help us along with figuring it out, and still no one has figured out the entire thing. It is, however, looking more and more likely every year that we eventually will figure it out, and he has apparently arranged things where upon his death the solution to this puzzle will be released, which is always nice. But I guess then we will have to replace this sculpture with another cryptic puzzle, and I think this should be an ongoing trend and tradition where there's like constantly a puzzle sculpture there, and every time it's solved it just maybe gets moved to a different part and replaced with a brand new cryptic sculpture. Lots of fun for all the family, and it does look pretty cool. And that is all we have time for. I really hope you're having a lovely day wherever and whenever you're watching this. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and as always, thanks for watching.